Hello and welcome to the top 10 most likely unseen issues for the strategic case study exam to be sat in November 2020 and February 2021. In this video, we're going to chart the top 10 most likely issues. We're going to talk about why we've chosen them, the kinds of issues that might arise based on those issues, key points to bring up, and theory that you can use when you answer the questions. But before we begin, I'm just going to explain why I've chosen these particular issues, my basis of choice, and also how you can use this information, how you can use these issues to prepare you for the exam. So we'll start by looking at the basis of choice. Why have I chosen these top 10 issues? Well, the first thing is the focus in the pre-scene. So is there a lot of material dedicated to this particular issue in the pre-scene? Or the opposite? Is there no mention of it, despite the fact that it should be a relevant thing for the company, in which case there's a chance that it may come up in the exam. And also the importance that the examiner attaches to that particular issue. Now, after every single sitting, the examiner publishes a report and they say that students didn't talk about X enough and students didn't talk about Y enough. So if that X topic, that Y topic is also relevant to the pre-scene and something that the examiners repeatedly said students don't talk about enough, then that also leads me to believe that that's a potential issue, because they're likely to test for things that they feel are important and things that they want students to be talking about. Also, the strategic importance, and we're thinking about the SWOT of the company, we're thinking about the directors and the strategy as well. What is generally important and genuinely important for the organization? Something that has a real impact on the strategy, on the critical success factors, etc., is far more likely to be an issue than something that would be completely irrelevant for this particular company. And finally, my own experience. I've looked at many past exams, read many examiners' reports. I've been teaching the strategic case study for many years now. I've reviewed dozens and dozens of pre-scenes, so I have a good idea of the kinds of questions that come up in the exam. And also, keep an eye out for the things that are easy to write questions for. If the examiner knows they can write a really decent question, it's going to test a good range of the CIMA syllabus, and they can write that really easily, they're more likely to write those sorts of questions than trying to write a really obscure question that's very difficult to create and tests a really, really specific, obscure part of the syllabus. So, that's why I've chosen these issues, and here's how you can use this information that you'll pick up in the video. The first thing is to prepare key models from the pre-scene information. So if I'm talking about certain issues, go back to the pre-scene information and prepare models based on that. So if I say, oh, you could use the SAF analysis to analyze this, you could use Mendelow's to analyze this issue, then go to the pre-scene, prepare your Mendelow's, prepare your SAF analysis, prepare your SWOT analysis, whatever it may be. But do remember to adapt it for new points in the unseen. If the unseen gives you more information and may even give you information that contradicts information in the pre-scene, remember to use the unseen, because the unseen is ultimately what you are being tested on. Then make sure you sit mock exams that cover these issues. So, for example, at Astranti, we prepare our mock exams based on these key issues, but also just sit as many mock exams as you can, because it's the best way to prepare you for the actual exam. It prepares you for managing your time, it prepares you for planning your answers, it prepares you for writing your answers effectively, all of which are really important when it comes to passing the strategic case study exam. Then find relevant real-life examples. So if we're talking about a particular issue that Knowledge City Technology Park is facing, then go online, find another technology park that exists in the real world and look at the kinds of things they've done. How have they overcome this problem? And again, those of you who are on the course, do check out the industry pack where we talk about our industry examples and we talk about our pre-prepared industry paragraphs. Then learn some of the typical key points, and this can be something as simple as the advantages and disadvantages. That can be a really good jumping off point for evaluating. For example, if you're talking about an issue like acquisition, or you're talking about something like risk management and the advantages and disadvantages of managing your risk, it's a good way just to break it down by what you can achieve from it, but also what the problems could be. Is it too expensive? Is it ineffective, etc.? And that will help with your analysis. And finally, be prepared to use models to support the issues. Think about how you would use a model to help persuade the examiner, persuade the marker of what you're about to say. Because you don't want to just write out the theory verbatim from a study text. You need to pick out the specific parts that are actually relevant, that are actually helping you to answer the question. So that's how you can use this analysis to help prepare you for the exam and to factor in as part of your revision. Now let's kick off our top 10 issues, starting with issue number 10. And the 10th most likely issue is ethics. Now, the reason why I have gone for ethics is because out of all the topics in the entire CIMA syllabus, it is the most commonly examined topic. Over the last 5+ years, the strategic case study has been being sat. Ethics has appeared in 40 to 60% of the variants. So, of those of you watching this video right now, 40 to 60% of you might get a question about ethics in your exam. That's how likely it is. It appears in most SCS variants, and CIMA, importantly, wants to be seen to be testing people on ethics. They have their own code of ethics. They expect all accountants to abide by that code of ethics, and they want to test you on ethics. So it's very, very likely to come up in some way, shape or form, simply because it's something that CIMA always wants to test. And there is focus on the pre-scene. It spoke about stakeholders in those values. It was speaking about integrity and making sure we were keeping our tenants' information safe, because it might be a matter of national security or at least commercial security. So we are holding on to information that is very important and things that we have to keep quiet. Also, there was talking about the health and safety and some of the problems with health and safety and what might happen if we didn't have the health and safety measures in place. So a likely issue could be something around health and safety, like a breach of health and safety where controls were not followed. So some likely issues for ethics: a breach of our values, perhaps looking at a new project. It's a short-term project, it's a one-off, but it involves compromising our values and thinking about the ethics of that. Is it in our nature to do that? Will we have to compromise some of our ethical values? In which case, should we do it or should we not do it? We've got legal liabilities as well with regards to health and safety and treatment of stakeholders, given the nature of the park as well. We've got lots of space that we're taking up, and spoke in the pre-scene about potentially expanding the various different offices, but what impact would that have on the environment if we're using up more green space, etc., and the energy that we're using. We've got vast amount of energy, electricity, water, etc., that we need to supply to the tenants on the park, and where is that coming from? Is it coming from sustainable sources, etc.? And also government contracts. Specifically mentioned in the pre-scene that some of the tenants are working on government contracts, things of national security, etc. And is there an ethical issue here? Because what does national security mean? If national security means developing some new horrible super weapon that the Adland government is going to use on some other country on the other side of the world, and we facilitated the production of that weapon and the research of that weapon by allowing the tenants that were producing it to set up shop on our site, is that a negative ethical issue for us, as in a guilty by association? Do we want that kind of publicity brought onto Knowledge City Technology Park? And even if it is a very profitable contract or something that will be really beneficial for our reputation and for government relations, etc.? Is it something that we actually want, given the ethical implications of it? So like the issues there, and key points to raise when you're talking about ethics, and this is not specific to any one of those issues, but general things to bring up when you're talking about ethics, is that CIMA expect you to take the moral high ground. Now, in reality, we all know that ethics is a grey area. There are certain things that you have to judge from both sides, and sometimes you might think, well, we have to breach ethics in this case, or it's not completely unethical, etc. But in the context of the CIMA exam, where they expect you to be highly ethical, you need to treat ethics as almost a black and white issue. It's either ethical or it's not ethical. And don't ever try to justify things like bribery, because that's never ethically acceptable. And when you are dealing with an ethical issue, do make a recommendation, and often put a two-pronged recommendation in. So talking about the short term and then also the long term. Because as we owe a duty of care to our stakeholders, it's not just about dealing with certain issues as and when they arise, but making sure these issues never arise again. So, for example, I've just put a random example here of changing a safety procedure because perhaps there's been an accident, or perhaps one of our health and safety people hasn't identified a particular issue in a tenant's building. So you deal with that by changing the safety procedure to make sure it never happens again. But how do we avoid other issues from happening in the future? How do we, in general, improve our safety? Well, perhaps it's more investment that's needed, more training, more equipment to stop these sorts of issues from ever arising again. So we're dealing with the specific issue in the short term, but we're also thinking to the future. We're also thinking about our obligations to our stakeholders to make sure it never happens again in the future. And relevant theory to bring up, the most obvious one is the CIMA ethical principles, the CIMA Code of Ethics. I'm sure you are aware of these. You've been learning them for a long time, and the examiner has specifically said you can almost always use this model when answering ethical questions. But, piece of advice here, when you are answering a question on ethics, perhaps it's an integrity question or an objectivity question, mention the CIMA ethical principles, and you may even want to just list them out, but then only talk about objectivity if it's an objectivity question. Only talk about integrity if it's an integrity question. Don't spend 2, 3, 4 paragraphs telling the marker about the theory behind professional behaviour when it's an objectivity question, because you will not get any marks for it. No matter how excellent it is, it may have hit the nail on the head as to what professional behaviour is. It's a brilliant piece on professional behaviour, but the question is about objectivity, so you're only going to get marks for talking about why it might be an objectivity breach and how to stop objectivity ethical issues. And the American Accounting Association resolution model, whilst not in the CIMA syllabus, is also a useful tool. Not because you actually need to know that model, but just because of the specific headings that are part of it. It can be good jumping off points for idea generation, which is something that students often struggle with. So if you're thinking about, is this an ethical issue? Well, did we actually owe a duty of care to that stakeholder? If we did, then perhaps it was an ethical breach by allowing whatever happened to them to happen. What are the end consequences of it? Is this going to actually be unethical if we don't do this? Now, is the end result actually an unethical thing? If not, then it's not an ethical duty to do it or to not do it, etc. And also the values and the norms as well. What is the actual ethical norm within Adverland? Is it an ethical country where the people of the country expect organisations to be ethical, etc.? And a good phrase is, it's simply the right thing to do. Yes, it might be more expensive to source from this ethical provider, but it's simply the right thing to do. Yes, it might be more expensive to keep these staff members on rather than outsource them to some other country around the other side of the world, but it's simply the right thing to do to keep them on. We have a duty of care to them. That sort of thing. That's how you can use ethics. That's how you can talk about ethics. And as I mentioned, CIMA expects you to be very ethical. Issue number 9 now. And issue number 9 is funding. Now, again, a very important topic, a very commonly examined topic. One of those things that appears every sitting, just like ethics does. And often it will not appear as its own topic. You won't be given a funding question, but it's an add-on topic. It usually comes along with any kind of investment or new project or acquisition, where you always have to have a little bit at the end talking about how it's going to be funded. And this is part of your role. The literature given by CIMA for the SCS role specifically mentioned suggesting and recommending where sources of funding were going to come from. So the reason why it's very likely is because it will form part of another question. It's very easy to include it as part of another question. It's part of your role and it's examined all the time. It's one of the key F3 topics as well. You need to know about where your funding is going to come from. Are you going to use equity funding from the stock market? You're going to use debt funding from lenders and banks. And also think about the cost of capital and the returns required by shareholders, the minimum return required by shareholders, and also cash flow as well, as in if you are going to go through situations where you don't have a nice steady flow of cash coming in, but you've got bills to pay, etc., what kinds of problems that can cause for the organization. So likely issues that could be a long-term funding requirement, such as an acquisition, which again is another kind of topic that is likely to come up in the exam, or a new project, or if we're just trying to grow the park and invest in more resources, more buildings, more equipment for the park, etc., how we're going to fund all of this. Also, a short-term working capital question could arise. The pre-scene specifically mentioned cash flow as a risk in the risk report, talking about how, because the tenants were startups, sometimes they go bankrupt, and of course then we're not getting that regular rental income from them, and mitigated it by having a stream of tenants come in, and also by having different tenants of different longevity statuses. And some have been there for many, many years and are very secure. But interestingly, in the pre-scene, it did say that there were more trade payables, so more current liabilities, than there were current assets, which gives us a current ratio of less than 1, which means we can't actually pay off our short-term debts with our short-term assets. And that could potentially cause a cash flow issue. So when we're thinking about key points to raise, as I mentioned there, we do have $264 million in the bank. But the current liabilities are already $368 million. So we couldn't pay off all our current liabilities with the cash that we currently have. And a lot of that will be needed for working capital, will be needed for employee salaries, etc. Yes, we can put our suppliers back a month or two, say, oh, we will pay you, but we just need a bit of an extension on our credit. But we can't do that with staff. Can't say to your staff that we're not going to pay you this month, we'll pay you next month instead. So it's very important that they have cash available for dealing with negative cash flow situations. They've budgeted effectively, which was already mentioned as a risk in the pre-scene. Also, given the size of the assets, so $6.6 billion, the fact that they've got this amount of money here, of which most of it will already be needed elsewhere, and let's say they also need to have a certain amount available just as buffer cash available for any contingency, they're not going to be buying more buildings and more equipment off that money alone. They're going to need to bring in additional money from lenders or from the market. But they could raise additional debt funding. The debt funding is currently quite low, the gearing at 13.93 or 16.8%, depending on which method you have used, whether that's long-term debt over equity or long-term debt over long-term debt plus equity. Again, there's no right or wrong answer there as long as you explain which one you've used and you use the same one each time. You don't use two different methods to compare 2 different years because obviously that will obscure the analysis. And we could use some of these assets as security to raise debt against. And banks aren't necessarily going to turn us away because of the low gearing. We are perhaps a lower risk as a potential company to lend money to. And the general structure in which you prioritize funding for, as in the order of funding. Usually you pay in cash if you can, because it's money you just simply have, although we don't have that much available given that it might be committed elsewhere. Then you use debt funding because it's quicker and cheaper to raise than equity funding, although the problem with it is you do have to pay it back. And then equity funding is usually last because it's very time consuming, it's very expensive to raise additional funds on the stock market. So it's usually only reserved for absolutely massive projects where you need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. And relevant theory to bring up here would be those advantages of equity and debt and the disadvantages of them as well, such as debt being a lot quicker, lower cost. We are in a good position, we've got a low gearing rate, we've got a good interest cover at the moment, etc. But with equity, the big advantage of it, because you do get a lot of money from it if it's done well, is that you don't actually have to pay it back. Now, if you've got a loan, you do have to make interest payments. You have to pay the loan back. But dividends are completely optional. You don't have to pay it back. But based on the information in the pre-scene, it looks like dividends will not be something that is optional for us to pay. Now, the company has a very, very low beta. It's remained very consistent in its share price for the last 5 years, and the fact that it has a low beta means that it's fluctuating less than the market average, or less than the market as a whole. But it pays a very high dividend, over 50%, compared to SciPark, the leading competitor, which actually only pays just over 4%. They're reinvesting it in the business. So what that could suggest is that the kind of shareholder that's investing in Knowledge City Technology Park is not a short-term investor that's trying to see capital gains. They're a longer-term investor that's using it as an income. They're relying on those dividend payments as income, which therefore they may not be the kinds of shareholders that will accept the non-payment of dividends. And another theory to use here would be Mendelow's matrix. So we put our shareholders and our lenders, if we borrow any money from the bank, in the Mendelow's matrix to ensure that they are catered for. We understand the influence and the interest that they have on the organization. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, you have found it useful. Just going to take a moment to tell you about the courses that we produce here at Astranti for our case studies. And all of the products that you see here are available as standard as part of the course, but they are also available for purchase individually. We have the Exam Technique series, which is a study text and a video series which looks at how to plan your answers, how to read the material and analyze the material effectively, and to manage your time effectively in the exam, which is incredibly important. Most people who fail the case study exam fail it because of poor exam technique. So that's a really important video series for you to watch to ensure that you've got that technique. Because there is a specific technique to sitting the case study exam, and all will be revealed in that video series. And do head over to the website for more information about it. We then have our theory revision series, which again is a study text and a video series, and that looks at the specific theories that are relevant to the case study, because a lot of the material from the E's, the P's, the F's won't appear in the case study. It's only specific topics that are frequently tested in the case study. So to save you from revising all the E's and all the F's and all the P's, we've created a more condensed revision series to refresh yourself of the knowledge that you'll need for the exam. We then have our pre-scene analysis series, which looks through the pre-scene page by page, bringing out the important points. In addition to that video series, there is also a video that looks at the top 10 most likely unseen issues, and also the strategic analysis video, which takes all the key models from the CIMA syllabus and applies them to the case. We then have our industry analysis pack, which is a large document that looks at the industry that the pre-scene is based on, looks at all the real companies that are actually operating in that actual industry in the real world, looks at how they market, what the suppliers are, what the key stakeholders are, how they operate, industry trends, and also a series of industry examples that you can use and reference in your exam. And we've got sample paragraphs to show you how you would use it in the exam, and that's a document. There's also an accompanying video with it. We have our mock exams, which are based on actual exams, but they feature the reference to the actual case, so they're on the actual case that you will sit the exam on. We've done our best to make them as close to the actual exams as possible, and you can actually sit those online in an online system that replicates the one that you'll use on the exam day, so you can really test yourself under exam conditions. And we provide marking and feedback for those mocks as well, where you'll get a tutor that will analyze your script and will give you a comprehensive document providing you with information not only on your actual script, as in whether you passed and failed and what you should have brought up and what you shouldn't have brought up, etc. But we'll also give you an appraisal on your technique as well, how to improve your exam technique. We then have our question packs, which is a series of shorter mock style questions based around the core activities. So if you find that you really struggle with certain parts of the CIMA syllabus, that will be a really good way for helping you. For example, if it's the core activity A's that you're always struggling with, or the B's that you're struggling with, you can look at the specific core activity A pack, which will give you questions based on those subjects. And then we have our masterclasses. We have 2 live all-day masterclasses, one at the start of the course and one at the end of the course. The one at the start of the course will give you all sorts of hints and tips on how to plan, how to use your time effectively. We'll also go through the planning process live, which will be really helpful for you as you progress into your mock exams. And then we have the revision masterclass right at the end, which looks at everything you've covered, gives you a refresher on everything you've covered over the 6-week period. And that's going to be really useful for giving you those little extra hints and tips to get you the extra marks in the exam. So do head over to the website www.astranti.com for more information about those. And I hope to see you again for the next video.